Hello and welcome to Straight Talk, Supply Chain Insights, the podcast for your supply chain leader who is on the go and wants to be in the know. And now, your host, Lora Cecere.
Welcome to Straight Talk with Supply Chain Insights. My name is Lora Cecere, and I'm the founder of Supply Chain Insights. And today I am joined by my good friend, Peter Bolstorff. Peter, introduce yourself briefly. Tell the group a little bit about what you're doing.
Sure, Laura. First of all, thanks for letting me join the discussion. I am on my third new venture, really focusing on some passions. One is really looking at supply chain excellence and the impact of good or bad AI. And then the second one is really doing research that I love. And that's part of the fun part with you.
Okay. So you spent many years at ASCM, 8 years?
10
years?
10
years. I consider you to be one of the most knowledgeable SCOR masters. For those of you who don't know, SCOR is the supply chain operating reference model. Did I get that right?
Operations reference model. You got it.
Operations reference model, right? And it's useful to help people to describe their supply chain because often a function will have a very different definition of a supply chain than another function. So for example, transportation may not know anything about order management or, manufacturing with inventory. And so it's useful as a mapping to help people to better understand supply chain. And I often find that in an organization, people have different meanings for the word supply chain. So it's a great background you have, Peter, and thanks for coming to the show today. And what we're going to talk about today is value. So, Peter, you were kind enough to come to the Georgia Tech event I had on December 5th, and you've been a great advocate of the work that I've done. And I'm just going to go into a little detail about the work, and then I'd like to talk to you a little bit about, your insights.
Yeah, love to.
So when I left AMR Research with a purchase by Gartner Group, I had worked on a project called the AMR Top 25. And imagine that you're in a conference room and you've got maybe 10 other colleagues and you disagree with them and you lose. And I always believed that you couldn't just put companies in a spreadsheet and shake them up, that Apple had nothing in common with Intel, with Dow, and that really companies needed to be compared against their industry peer groups. But that's easier said than done because there's no real good definition of an industry peer group. The NACS codes don't work very well. The SIC codes don't work very well. And so one of the things that I did when I started my new company, and it's amazing, 2011, 2013. So now, I've been in business for like 12 years. I wanted to come up with a methodology that would help people to understand, are they creating more value or less value than their peer group? So Regina and I started collecting data from a synchronized data feed called Y charts and putting them into peer groups, 28 peer groups. Now, to get a peer group, I used my observations in the market and input from the SIC codes and the NACS codes, and we interviewed companies. So, for example, we interviewed Schneider Electric. Would you consider these to be your peer companies? And we interviewed Honeywell and Airbus, et cetera. And after a period of interviews, we came up with a peer group. And these are public companies because you really can't get to private companies. And then we hired a statistician by the name of George Runger after we had started doing a technique called orbit charts to look at how could we basically do a mathematical evaluation of the intersection of metrics, operating margin and inventory turns, return on invested capital and growth, to find out, once we got the patterns, were these better or worse than the peer group? And so George helped us with development of the supply chain index, which is, are you making more improvement than your peer group? And also to come up with a ranking system against the patterns in those two comparisons, growth versus ROIC and operating margin versus inventory turns. And then we started publishing every year a document called the Supply Chains to Admire. Now, this year I haven't published yet, and it's sitting here on my desk. And Regina got all of her work done in March, but I've been working with Georgia Tech to try to build what I'm going to call the fundamental score. So the fundamental score is a metric based upon the regression analysis that Georgia Tech's been doing. So Georgia Tech has built a model for each of the industries, and we're testing the models now to say, can we predict 2023 based upon the data from 2013 to 2019, a lot like backcasting for those that do it in forecasting. And we're trying to say, are these good models? Then, given if they're good models, we're going to take the betas from those formulas, and we're going to look at the value created of that company versus the peer group on the regression analysis. And you came to the meeting, so you know that the 4 metrics that have a high correlation in regression analysis by industry are operating margin, revenue per employee, return on capital invested does better than ROIC, and inventory turns. So when I published this year's Supply Chains to Admire, which it should have published in March, but we've been embroiled in this research, it will contain the fundamental score, which says, our company's driving more value than their peer group, and value is driven by a comparison of market cap per employee. And we did a lot of testing of different metrics of what could be an objective function, EBITDA, the investor fundamental score, price to tangible book, price to book, So we've done a lot of testing. We've been 17 months into this. And I tell you, it's a little bit awkward working with guys that love the model, right? Like I said in the back of the statistics class, and I did my regression models for homework, but these guys actually after dinner when I'm playing Scrabble build regression models, right? And they have so much fun playing with them, it's hard to get them to stop. So, when you came to Georgia Tech, we presented the formulas for the industries and had a discussion about those 4 metrics and talked about the background of the fundamental score. So what do you think of the concepts?
So when you think about, kind of where we have our passions, I have a lot of passion for learning a good idea and being able to teach other people how to use it. And so with, your book Metrics That Matter and your early work with the Supply Chains to Admire and the orbit charts, I've been using those 2 pair of metrics to really talk about shareholder value at the highest level, right? Because again, supply chain professionals, even at the CSCO level, still need to be able to tell the story to their peer group, which would be the C-suite, right? And when you dive into supply chain cost and some of the more mechanical things underneath that, sometimes you lose the story. And I found what the orbit charts or the Supply Chains to Admire metrics did is to really help tell a story of how my supply chain was contributing towards the value of the organization. The second thing it did was it plotted strategy over time. Because again, all of us have been victims of, continuous improvement, where, if you just have enough things on the wall, something will stick, or, you have leaders come in and out and, they have their own agenda and they work on one thing at one end of the supply chain and they just see it like a balloon punch out at the other side. So the orbit chart and the way of communicating revenue and investment and inventory and margin really make it obvious which companies are strategic with their supply chain and which ones are not. And again, the first question everybody has when they're thinking about supply chain excellence is, well, how do I compare to somebody else? And you don't have to do a lot of effort to get a Y chart or there's not a lot of effort to be able to say, well, here's the metrics for my company. And then here's how I compare to my industry peer group amongst the 28. So again, I come at it from a user of the concept, helping organizations kind of frame up, I'm either with or better, worse, or on par. The work with the Georgia Tech folks on getting it down to a fundamental score, kind of like the analyst, fundamental score, really is going to make it numerically black and white where I rank. And I know, again, when we think about the Gartner Top 25, you know it better than me, but from an outsider's point of view, there's a lot of qualitative input that goes into that ranking. And
50%, it's a beauty contest, right?
So the other thing is it's really oriented around large companies.
Right.
And when you think about, all of the small, medium and bigger companies, all the way up to 5 billion, there's a ton. And you and I have had this discussion before. What I find is, and I called it the canyon concept, organizations that have huge suppliers and that have huge customers have to be 10 times better in their supply chain just to be able to, live, in that environment. And what the fundamental score and what the, supply chains to admire metrics do is that allow us to compare regardless of size. And I think what's going to unearth in that concept is, sometimes we may be looking at the wrong companies when we think about leading practice, just because they're big. So long answer to a very short question, Lora, but I am super pumped about this, and I'm really pumped to be able to start using it.
I'm pumped for you to use it. And I'm pumped to get the work done. It's been like a year and a half of, let's finish our regression analysis, meet on Tuesday morning. My Georgia Tech folks who are statisticians just love to model, and they love to have 7 factors for, an additional 0.02 R squared. And I'm like, no, we really want to have a simple model that is very usable. And I'm excited that we have that. So when I published this report, which the draft's sitting over here to my left, and it's been sitting there for the last 3 weeks, I keep putting my coffee mugs on it, and it looks pretty bad right now. But I'm hoping that everyone in the industry will look at their fundamental score and their orbit charts. And we give everybody orbit charts if they ask us, because we want to help the industry, because we've got enough craziness of, so-called experts running around that really aren't grounded. I hope everyone takes the fundamental score and their orbit charts and has a really good discussion about what is supply chain excellence. Because if we can align on supply chain excellence, I think that we can do far better on sustainability. We can do far better on meeting shareholder goals, and we can stop a lot of craziness. And I'm just amazed at how much craziness we get into because we're really focused on functional metrics. And a lot of times people will say, well, they want to get out of functional metrics and move from cost to value. But organizationally, that's hard because our bonus incentives are tied to functional metrics. Our history is tied to functional metrics. Our functions know functional metrics. They don't necessarily know how to talk the language of the P&L and the balance sheet. And so at a cultural level, it requires unlearning and a lot of change management. And you saw a lot of that at Georgia Tech. What would be your advice to people as they get ready to read this mangled report that's on my left-hand side and have this conversation to really tackle that unlearning and change management?
So I'm a mathematician at heart, Lora. So I was in the front row of stats class, right? So forgotten more than I remembered. But I think the first thing that I would do and recommend is actually do a Y chart, your own orbit, set of our orbit charts. Because I think really grounding yourself in terms of, when you think about your supply chain and how it operates, and you think about your company and how it was able to get positive return on invested capital and grow revenue at the same time as improving inventory turns and improving operating margins. If you're going every year and you're making that set of improvements, there's something about your supply chain that is strategic. And the question becomes, again, you and I both are thinking about that. We have our own points of view on what does excellence look like. And, so, when you think about the SCOR model, there's some foundational processes you have to have in place. There are some measures you have to have that, diagnostically help you understand how to solve problems faster. There are some people skills that you have to be able to operate it. And then there are some basic practices that need to be in place that aren't dependent on, a leader being there. They're ingrained. And so I think first, do the work of the orbit charts, and then second, really try to ask yourself, how is my supply chain, how do I define my supply chain today? How do my processes operate today? Am I using all of the tools that I purchased 5 years ago? Yes or no? What are those digital capabilities that are important for me to add value? So a lot of those mechanics. I'm waiting for the fundamental score so that I can deep dive in terms of some next round, I'll call it more qualitative questions, that would say, okay, if you had this combination of fundamental scores, let's deep dive into this particular area of the supply chain and take a look under the hood. I'll stop
Yeah.
there.
Well, I think it's fascinating. I recommend that people do orbit charts by division and by region, however they make decisions, because what they'll see is the stories are quite different. And I was talking to someone in pharma the other day that had small molecules, big molecules, generic, and each of those are very different supply chains with different
Right.
peer groups, right? And what they can see over time is, are they making progress or not? And then analyze for their own organization why, right? So, one of my favorite stories, and I'm an old dog now, as I worked with a food company that kept shorting orders, and they wanted to improve inventory and improve orders. And so they believed in that, simple triangle of, inventory, customer service, and forecast, right? That simple triangle. But what they failed to realize was that their asset strategy was totally out of whack. So they were trying to run their assets at 105% utilization, which anybody that runs manufacturing knows that that just isn't enough asset. And because they sandbagged the forecast and they had so much bias, they constantly were trying to put more load on the manufacturing line than it was possible, and their culture wouldn't let them outsource it. But they couldn't have a good conversation about it because they were so caught up in functional metrics and they couldn't see the pattern over time. And a lot of that was how they did bonus incentives, right? So people made a lot of money for making bad decisions. And so when I was talking to this person in the pharmaceutical industry, it harkened me back to, sometimes our bonus incentives are so rich that it's hard for us to back up and do the right thing for a more holistic answer because, our history just hasn't had us do that. So anyway, I'm hoping that tomorrow when I meet with Georgia Tech that we can get on with the fundamental score and I can get this report out. And I'd love to have you come back and talk about what you've learned on the fundamental score and, how people can use it, because I think it's really powerful. And I'm hoping that ignites a whole conversation in the industry around what drives excellence. Because I don't find it is a technology or a consultant. I find that it's often great leadership and great product and the ability to serve the customer with that great product through that great leadership. And, many times I think we have the wrong discussions in the industry about technology A versus technology B, or, even we have bad practices that come in place that we don't really measure. So I really look forward to talking to you about the score when we get it done.
So the one thing I want to plant in the back of your mind, and this is a back to the future moment. So we both know that data, supply chain data, both inside of a company and everywhere else, is probably not really good, right? And if you were to ask the typical company is, do you have clean data? They would say, oh, they would laugh.
Mm-hmm.
Mix that with, what percentage of the technology that you purchased, whether you purchase it intentionally or not, doesn't matter, but you're only using, maybe a third at most of what you purchased. Well, we've got this whole AI tech hype moving forward on top of all of that. I think leaders in the next 2 years are going to need to pay attention to that aspect, because again, let's pair revenue and return on invested capital. There's still a lot of tech investment that has generated no revenue and actually has actually taken the other two metrics, operating margin and inventory turns, backwards.
Right.
And so I think there's a lesson to be learned from that past as we start thinking through this hype cycle, because again, AI's got a lot of things to offer when applied appropriately and focused on the right set of tasks. But if we're doing another podcast in 3 years talking about how return on invested capital or return on capital employed, has taken another dip with no revenue impact, again, we're just repeating the same set of things that we've done in the past. So I just want to keep that out in front of us. The other one I want to keep out in front of us, Lora, is this idea of kind of writing it down. I know from a supply chain excellence standpoint, I have a passion on those 3 words. And I think the questions that I'm getting, especially, are going to get asked when they see the score. Okay, I see I'm below average and I see where my peer group is. What do I do about it?
Right.
And I think we need to be prepared to answer that question.
Well, and that is a whole series. And we had a great discussion. I think it was the starter at Georgia Tech.
Yep.
And it started when I asked the group if they knew what operating margin was. And, there was this pregnant silence that went through the group, right? So most people know functional cost. They may not know how to calculate total cost, but, they don't know what margin is, right? And so when we had the discussion about how can a supply chain leader improve margin, that was an hour and a half. And I thought that was a good discussion, right? And I think we should have the same discussion, you and I, on each of the metrics, and maybe even put pen to paper, Peter, about, a handbook that allows people to use it. And I think that'll be fun. And then I think the next thing that we need to do is do that second level metrics, because you can't just, hook the wagon to the SCOR metrics and press a go button, right? And so that second tier metrics of customer service, and I think forecast value add, not forecast error.
Right.
And we'll put in a couple more, and, we need to look at the correlations. And one of the things I'm hoping we can do in 2025 is get some volunteers to help us test those models, right?
Yep, absolutely. And I think, again, just putting the practice edge on it, so how do we take the theory to practice just as a reinforcement?
Well, Peter, thank you for your partnership on this, and have a great holiday.
You do the same, Lora.
Bye now. Until next time, this is Straight Talk with Supply Chain Insights. Peter and I will be doing podcast every other week until he gets tired of talking to me. Bye now.